Happy Thanksgiving week, everyone. I hope you're all ready for some turkey and stuffing. But before we all get to the big feast.
You want to dig into the real story behind this holiday?
Exactly. We've got a ton of sources here about the Mayflower,
Early settlers,
even indentured servitude.
all connected to Thanksgiving in some surprising ways.
You know, maybe some of those stories we've heard about the first Thanksgiving aren't quite the whole picture.
Well, let's see if we can debunk some myths and get a more accurate view of Thanksgiving's origins.
One of the sources here talks about modern Thanksgiving traditions,
Yeah.
focusing on, gratitude and community.
Right, which are great.
Wonderful sentiments.
Yeah, but then there's this source on indentured servitude, and it really shines a light on how complicated the labor system was in the colonies.
And it also reveals that the Mayflower wasn't just full of pilgrims seeking religious freedom, as many believe.
Oh, yeah, lots of the passengers were actually indentured servants.
Exactly.
I never really thought about that. This list of Mayflower passengers really shows that it's quite a diverse group, more than just the typical pilgrim image we have.
For sure. And this indentured servitude source says that something like,
Between 1/2 and 2/3
wow,
of all European immigrants to the 13 colonies came over under these contracts.
that's a huge chunk of people.
Mm.
It really makes you rethink who those early settlers really were.
It does paint a different picture, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so another thing I always pictured, I guess we all do, is Mayflower like this.
Grand passenger ship.
Yeah, exactly. But this source is saying it was actually just,
A Dutch cargo ship.
what?
A cargo ship!
180 tons.
Seriously, 180 tons with 102 passengers crammed in there for over 2 months.
It was designed to transport goods, not people.
It must have been awful. Storms, limited food, no space.
Definitely not a luxury cruise.
I bet. And forget about sanitation.
Oh, I'm sure that was lovely.
They even had to use a metal jack screw that was meant for building houses to fix the ship during a storm.
They really had to make do with whatever they had, huh? That's crazy. And then thinking about all those passengers, many of them not even coming here by choice, but because of these indentured servitude contracts.
Adds a whole other dimension to the story, doesn't it?
Totally. So I've always wondered, what's the real difference between indentured servitude and slavery?
Well, this source on slave definition explains it pretty clearly. Indentured servants had contracts with a set end date. Slavery, on the other hand, offered no such freedom.
Okay, so with indentured servitude, you knew there was an end in sight, even if things were rough.
Right, and this other source on indentured servitude says most contracts were like 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years.
Servants got food, lodging, and some training.
Okay, so they weren't totally left to fend for themselves.
No, but they didn't get paid wages. After their term, though, they were free.
So not slavery, but
But still a pretty tough deal.
no kidding. This source actually quotes a historian named Richard Hofstadter, and he suggests that down in the South.
The treatment of indentured servants could be just as bad as the treatment of enslaved people.
Wow. So maybe when we tell those Thanksgiving stories,
Yeah.
we're kind of,
Missing some of the nuances.
for
It's
sense.
definitely more complicated than the simple narratives we often hear.
It is. Speaking of complicated, this list of Mayflower passengers is full of interesting tidbits.
Like what?
Well, there are these 4 children, the Moore children, who came over as indentured servants placed with different families.
So not all those families arriving in the New World came willingly together like we often imagine.
Right. And then there's William Mullins, the shoemaker, who brought 126 pairs of shoes.
126. Maybe he planned to set up shop in the new colony?
Or maybe he just really liked shoes.
Either way, it's a detail that makes you think.
It does. It reminds you that these were real people with real lives and motivations. Some came for religious freedom,
Others for economic opportunity.
and some, like those kids, had no say in the matter at all.
It's a mix of stories, really.
Definitely. And then there are the crew members listed here, like the master gunner. He didn't make it through that first winter.
Each name on this list represents a life, a story.
And I think that's something important to remember as we explore the real history of Thanksgiving. It's about those individual stories, about the complexities they reveal.
It's about looking beyond the romanticized versions and seeing the full picture, even the difficult parts.
I think that's a great place to take a break.
That sounds good to me. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the romanticized version of the past, especially when it comes to holidays like Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you think of those warm and fuzzy images of shared meals and family.
Exactly. But these sources really highlight some things we tend to forget, like the roles of indentured servants and enslaved people.
And how economic motivations really drove a lot of early colonial life.
all factors that shaped the world that led to that first Thanksgiving.
Definitely a far cry from the simple stories I remember hearing as a kid.
And that's why engaging with these sources is so important.
To challenge those assumptions we have.
To really wrestle with the complexities of history.
So we've debunked some myths about the Mayflower passengers. But where do we go from here? How does this new understanding of early colonial labor shape how we think about the foundation of America?
It's big picture stuff, for sure.
It is.
And it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about how reliant America was on forced labor in those early years.
Yeah, both indentured servitude and later on chattel slavery.
Both playing a huge role in the economic development of the colonies.
So these systems weren't just some side note in history. They were central to how colonial society functioned.
Absolutely. And the indentured servitude source actually points out that for a long time, indentured servants were a major source of labor in the colonies.
I mean, they worked the fields, built the houses, and really fueled the growth of the economy.
Precisely.
But we've got to remember that key difference between indentured servitude and slavery that the slave definition source lays out.
Right. Indentured servitude had a contract and end date, even if the conditions were often terrible.
But with slavery,
There was no such hope of freedom.
they were considered property.
With absolutely no rights.
It's chilling. Even though this indentured servitude source talks about servants receiving food and lodging and some training,
There's also evidence of harsh treatment and exploitation.
for sure. And even after their term of service ended, it wasn't like they were guaranteed a good life.
Freedom didn't necessarily equal prosperity. They still faced tons of challenges.
It makes you think about how we view Thanksgiving as this celebration of gratitude.
It does.
I mean, who are we truly grateful to? And whose stories are we missing when we tell that Thanksgiving story
those are really important questions to consider, especially this time of year.
as we approach the holiday?
It's about moving towards a more honest and inclusive celebration of Thanksgiving by understanding the full context.
You know, it's funny, we always say we want to avoid those controversial topics at the Thanksgiving table, but
But maybe a little historical context could make the conversations even better.
maybe.
Mm-hmm.
This deep dive has really hammered home the point that the traditional Thanksgiving story is just too simple, too romanticized,
There's so much more to it.
a much more complex reality. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
You said it.
And the more you dig, the more interesting it gets.
That's the beauty of history. Always more to discover.
So are there other sources you think we should be looking at to get a deeper understanding of Thanksgiving? What else should we be exploring?
Well, we haven't really touched on the Native American perspective.
Well, that's true. We've been focusing on the European settler side of things.
And their perspective is crucial to a full understanding of Thanksgiving, how they view and experience this holiday.
Yeah, like we were saying earlier, it's all about challenging our assumptions and getting a complete picture.
And that includes incorporating the voices and perspectives that are often left out of the traditional Thanksgiving story.
A more balanced and respectful understanding of the holiday and all its complexities.
Exactly.
Those missing voices, those untold stories, they offer so much valuable insight.
They do.
Thanksgiving is often seen as a uniquely American holiday, but it's rooted in a history that involves so many cultures and perspectives.
Yeah, it shows how important it is to approach history with, an open mind, a willingness to learn.
Definitely.
Speaking of learning, one thing that really surprised me was about the term pilgrim.
Oh, yeah.
Turns out it wasn't even really used back then.
That's right. This source on Pilgrims, Plymouth Colony, says they mostly call themselves
Oh, they call themselves
saints or like
Greats comers?
saints or first comers. That's so different from what we think of when we hear pilgrim.
It really is.
It's interesting how the term pilgrim, like this image of a religious journey,
Yeah.
really became popular much later in the 1800s as Thanksgiving evolved.
As the holiday took shape, the language around it changed too.
So even how we talk about these historical events is shaped by how people saw them later on.
Exactly. It makes you think about how powerful perspective really is.
Yeah, it does. And how important it is to be aware of the labels we use when we're talking about history.
Definitely.
So after all this unpacking of Thanksgiving's origins, what does it mean for us today? As we get ready to sit down at our Thanksgiving tables, what should we be thinking about?
I think it's a challenge for us to really think about the stories we tell ourselves about the past.
Okay, so
Acknowledge the complexity, the hardships, the parts that don't fit that traditional narrative,
to see the full picture even when it's not pretty.
and to be open to expanding our understanding.
Yeah, to consider those perspectives that we don't usually hear.
Like the stories of those indentured servants.
Or the Native American perspective.
It's about acknowledging that there's always more to learn.
More voices to listen to.
So this Thanksgiving, as we're giving thanks for all that we have,
We could also remember those who came before us.
yeah, and acknowledge the struggles they faced and the complexities of the past.
Honor their resilience, their strength, everything they contributed to the nation we live in today.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And maybe use this holiday as a chance to learn more, to grow, and to work towards a future where we're more inclusive and understanding.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives to consider as you gather with your loved ones this Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Happy Thanksgiving.